it was, in fact, once again, based upon this notion of freedom of speech, the idea that you didn't want people penalizing you for expressing an unpopular view. And now, in a certain sense, it is frequently being used as a shield that people will sometimes use, but it's actually, I would say, at least in my own experience, it's not that common to see someone who's tenured that a university really wants to fire but can't. It happens from time to time.
But the problem are not the tenure. The problem is that the tenure usually dictate the standard of the assistant professors.
Yeah.
How they're gonna get promoted and how with discipline. So that's the problem. The problem is not their tenureship, but what they are doing with that.
I agree, because the whole process tends to try to produce individuals who accept a shared set of beliefs with the rest of the university, and that can be rather difficult. And so,
well, and somebody who's going through a tenure track process, they've got so much to do. I told you about my friend who just couldn't make it. Anyway, the process is so very difficult. How available is an opportunity for this person to kind of go off the grid? Oh, no. If this is the model that they need to follow to achieve tenure in 3 years, 5 years, this is what they have to do, and you start to get carbon copies. And so then perhaps you need to wait until after that person is tenured and not at risk so much so, willing to pursue some alternative kinds of programs.
yeah.
So I just want to chime in a different perspective here. I have, I run a financial firm and I counsel people and their families. I have seen tenure change dramatically in the last 20 years in some of my people who worked within the academia world. A retired professor of English who had nothing but wonderful things to say about his whole career, and he probably would have been a wonderful guy to be in the lecture class. An anthropologist, same thing. And I have a guy right now who should have been retired years ago, but has just been knocking himself out, staying in the world, to be at the college, and he doesn't have the same pleasures derived from his work that some of my other retirees do. And because we started going down the road of entrepreneurship, innovation, and we've kind of morphed into this, I'll just let you know, I'm an entrepreneur. To your thought, I was always that way. I had my first business at 15 running the lawn service. When I've been inside another organization, meaning the buck starts here is how an entrepreneur could use it, but when I'm going in another organization in a managerial role, I brought the same mindset. I took things that were losing money, turned them around, got it righted, and I did feel the responsibility for controlling everything because my mindset didn't change, whether we're looking at different titles. But educational systems are, by their very nature, complex organizations. At the original core of every university, somebody took an entrepreneurial step to create that organization. But you might get bogged down on innovation things. The first thing that appealed to me when I met Grandon was the innovation of the mindset of the program he was describing. That appeals to an entrepreneur, always will. But when I look at the education, I sure hope there's opportunity for entrepreneurial efforts within education because, frankly, that's why I'm coming to school. I want to be able to help educate some others out there. Probably not in the classroom setting like you are, though I love ad hoc, but I think that the point is if education is communicating an idea for the betterment of someone else, it fits within business, it fits within a university. So I hate that people are arguing over items that really kind of coincide together pretty darn well. But I think the university structure, at least from what I've seen, certainly has changed the enjoyment the professors are having along the way. That's at least my personal perspective.
Well, and I think, but all of this, we need to be careful about generalizing on all these things because it is possible to innovate within an institution. Sometimes you have to wait around for the opportunity. It is possible to have a good time. Now, for instance, I feel like I'm a little overworked at the moment, but I'm having a great time doing the things that I wanted to do.
But I think when I'm listening to this, there's two different time frames. There's the tenured faculty, seasoned faculty expert, and that person should have the protection or feel like you can take some risks and be innovative and be entrepreneurial. That young faculty who is in the tenure process and promotion process can still take an entrepreneurial attitude and risk take and be involved in interdisciplinary things. I think that it's the same risk taking. So instead of publishing in the journals in immunology, you're involved in solving an important problem that takes immunologists and people from 10 other fields. That's risk taking. That's then in a sense. And so if you have the right environment and you have the right protection, if you will, and if that's going to be recognized as having value, then you make that assessment. Or you might back up and say, no, that's too risky, and tenure becomes the overwhelming goal, and then you don't become an interdisciplinary person or entrepreneurial in other ways.
I like that definition of risk-taking as kind of the measure of all of this.
Yes.
So even when a person doesn't create a unique opportunity, you mentioned the accountant, for example, there's a tremendous risk even in starting in an established practice. There's a risk in going beyond the norm within the university. Most entrepreneurs, we may weigh risks, but usually is not an impediment. It is generally something you just assume they're going to be risks, and you move forward with whatever the objective is. And so I'm sorry we kind of got bogged down in some of the vernacular, but I, for one, am hoping that we're going to see a higher level of risk-taking put forth by the interdisciplinary, as you just mentioned, because I think that's truly the stuff that is going to inspire the next generation of the traditional sense entrepreneurial spirit. We don't see as many people being developed.
So I think the attitude is this attitude that it's more about the work. It's all about the work. It's all about the purpose or the value as opposed to titles and whatever. So with that young faculty member who would be willing to engage and risk taking of being highly interdisciplinary or innovative, then has a mindset that, well, when it comes to the tenure decision, they may decide that doesn't have adequate value according to our standards. But if you believe in the work, then you say, well, this just isn't the place for me, and then somebody will value your work. I think that's what you correct, and that's the kind of mindset.
So, Grandon, another item for innovation, piggyback innovation. The best speech I ever saw was 1990 Bill Gates, and he stepped up and he said that, and he was talking about Microsoft DOS. He said, if we don't obsolete ourselves, then somebody else will. So in industry, the reason why we're very innovative is we're fearful that our competitor is going to obsolete us. So, and I look at education, I think maybe you guys have a false sense of safety, and you don't recognize that you might be quickly becoming obsoleted with all the technology coming out. If you don't find a way to innovate and reinvent yourselves and get out of 300-person lecture classes for undergraduates and online learning products, and even things like the DBA program might ultimately obsolete traditional PhD programs. Matt will have an interesting perspective on that in 5 years, having been product of one and the director of another. But you guys don't seem to be scared about being obsoleted by your competition.
Well, and I think we're just reaching the point where many universities are starting to see the risks associated with behaving in the same way. You look at a typical budget in our university, and over the years, the percentage of our budget paid for by the state has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And for the most part, we've been able to deal with that by increasing tuition at a fairly substantial rate. So we can make up for most of it. But what we're seeing now is if you look at the budget of a typical college in our university, some percentage, like well over 90% of that budget, is salaries that simply cannot be controlled, which leaves very, very little extra money for things like research expenses, travel expenses, and so forth. And should we have another budget cut or another downturn, we'll reach the point where there will be absolutely no money for anything else but salaries. And the problem out, without a little bit of grease to oil the wheels, the wagon will stop rolling. And that's a really serious
The best
concern.
thing that could happen to the university, in my opinion, is just an opinion, okay?
And
Is not to have money for the salaries.
yeah, and sadly, that's the way it Well, but actually, no, this is, a point.
So they have to be productive somehow. Each professor by himself, each group of professors, the university as a total. The best thing that could happen, we have just 50% of the money for the salaries.
Oh, yeah. As Najib drives a knife into my heart, I think that there is, if you look at the way universities originally evolved, professors were not paid that much. They essentially made their way on the outside. They tutored people. They did whatever the 19th century equivalent of consulting was. They did all these things. If you take a look, professors' salaries have been rising substantially over time. You never hear this from the professors themselves, but they've been rising substantially over the period of time. So now professors, especially in fields like business, can make a pretty good living without doing anything on the side. And that does tend to create a certain static nature. The folks who are doing really interesting things are often the adjuncts who have to go from school to school to school to make ends meet, and they do all sorts of interesting things because they have to. So, in a very real sense, that what Najib is saying, there is some truth that we really wanted innovation. Now, the problem is professors whine like mad, and we would hear whining of a magnitude that you've never heard of if you've done that. But I think we're actually moving in the direction where suddenly salaries will start to become at risk if we don't find other opportunities. And at my university, I'm starting to see this. The history of the DBA program is a little bit interesting, so I'll just give you a brief background. I first became interested in the DBA in 2002 when I got a call from, I went to my 20th business school, my MBA reunion. This is the reunion where basically I come in as the poverty case and everyone laughs at me. But I had a section mate of mine call me and said, look, I've made $150 million, and now I really want to teach and I want to do a doctorate, but I can't do it full time, so I got to manage my estate. So, what have you got for me? So I started investigating, trying to find out what would fit this guy's criteria. He was a very, very bright guy, So I found the program at Case Western University. I put him in touch with Case Western University. He actually was pretty close to enrolling, and then he goes over to Eastern Europe and just dies. So that was the end of that particular thing. He's young, but that I guess it sometimes happens. But this has put something in my head because I'm thinking, wow, this guy from Harvard Business School would really like to do a part-time doctorate, and for folks at that school, money is no object. So I'm thinking, boy, there's probably money to be made doing that. That was when I sent my first memo to the dean at that time. One of many memos that actually got lost in the process that I never heard back from. So in 2007, this time I'm in charge of the survey for my MBA class. We're having our 25th reunion. And so I surveyed the class, and since I'm in charge of the survey, I had a bunch of questions. One of the questions I ask is, what occupation would you like to do if you weren't doing your current job? And I give a list of 20 occupations. Interesting side note, we had 2 people who indicated they would rather do manual labor than their current job. And they both had a net worth of over $50 million. That was the highest net worth category, but 30% of them wanted to be college professors. So, they all want my job. Yeah, because they're all wealthy and so at that point I say, wow, there really is an opportunity there. So I wrote my next detailed memorandum to our dean, which also got lost I don't know if it was lost, but I don't believe it was ever read. So at that point, I started doing a systematic research investigation of all these programs. I go over to Germany for 6 weeks to work in a doctoral program there, doing a case method seminar to see what it was like. Their doctors are very different from ours, and they were trying to become more like us, and I was trying to say, no, don't do it, don't go there. But at any rate, so I write a couple of papers, and I incorporate it in my books, and like all research, I expect it will have no impact whatsoever. And for a number of years, that was okay. That's what happened. So our new dean comes in, and our new dean came in, I think it was 2012, and he goes around and talks to individual faculty members, and I'm like the second faculty member he talks to, and he says, okay, Grandon, what should you be doing? What should we be doing? And I said, well, there are 3 things that we need to do. We need to increase our distance learning, we need to increase our case writing, and we need to develop an executive doctoral program. Because those were 3 areas where I felt that we were, lagging behind and where I could see some potential advantages. Well, he'd been thinking about executive doctoral programs at his last institution, and at that point, it went pretty much full speed ahead. I don't think we've ever put together a program of this magnitude in such a short period of time. But it was because we had a very clear vision for the program, but also because there was the theory that eventually the program might be able to generate some positive resources for the university, and that was a big issue. Now, was that entrepreneurial? Well, in a sense, I never risked my day job doing that. But on the other hand, I could have wasted an awful lot of time. Actually, the faculty voted it in unanimously twice, which I thought was very impressive. But that's because we had a very clear identity. We had a very clear focus. And interestingly, that was the result of my research. In other words, I had a very clear idea what such a program should be after having thought about it for such a long time. And so, basically the thing moved very smoothly. And you can see the result here. As I mentioned in my keynote, you can't swing a cat around hitting a BBA student at this conference. But something that has offended numerous cat lovers already, I know. But at any rate, if you look at the things that made this possible, the fact that resources were not entirely available, that there's a resource threat definitely was part of it. Part of it was kind of, it's not so much a dissatisfaction, but a kind of frustration with our PhD program, our regular PhD program. Because if you take a look at the regular PhDs, it's very hard, no matter how good the candidate is, it's very hard for someone from our PhD program to end up at an institution that would be ranked higher than we are, or even to move laterally, because that's not the way PhD students get hired. And so it's kind of frustrating. We're training the students, in a sense, for the wrong thing. We ought to be training them to work in a school where they're going to be teaching 3 or 4 classes a semester, and where teaching is going to be very important, and where the journals that they can aspire to are mid-level. That's where most of them are going to go. Instead, we're training them as if they were going to be going to the absolute top universities in the country, which we would love nothing more than that, but it hasn't happened yet. There was some dissatisfaction with the existing program, but ultimately, I think probably the thing that got the program going was the clear vision. But the question, that we need to ask if we're looking to innovate in education is, where is the clear vision for our education going to come from? Because it's all well and good to say we want to innovate and We want, there are barriers that we have to come, but, where do we want to go? So I'd like to sort of ask that question next. If we want to talk about innovation, what is it that our institutions need, and this is both in the U.S. and internationally, to make us more effective? I can tell you that if I were to go out and say, well, we need to train people for jobs better, some people in the administration would applaud, and a lot of faculty would start saying, trade school, we're not a trade school. So what is it that we want to, aspire to? Because if we're going to be innovators, I'm not going to use the E word. If we're going to be innovators in education, there has to be some direction we want to go. So
This direction.
Oh, okay.
Work integrated teaching and learning integrated working, a love story between academia and working life.
I thought the presentation this morning was absolutely wonderful. I love the presentation, but we can't all go to Sweden. So,
It's self-actualization. I mean, these DBA students you're bringing in, they're very well off. They're in wonderful positions. They're making a lot of money. They're doing very well for themselves, but they determined individually themselves. Nobody told them they needed to come into the program. They themselves determined they wanted something more, and it's something self-actualization for them.
okay. Self-actualization. Now that's right at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which while it doesn't have a lot of psychological basis, has a lot of common sense and resonance with it. So that's why it kind of sticks around. There are some people who go for self-actualization as opposed to food down at the bottom. But nevertheless, it is an interesting hierarchy. But who should be paying for self-actualization if that's going to be one of our goals?
One thing that's sullied this whole discussion over the last 30 or 40 years,
Well, I'm glad you said 30 or 40 years, not 30 or 40 minutes, because I didn't think it was sullied here.
has been the community college experience. The idea is that after the 60s, 70s, trade schools pretty much just started not to exist anymore, and the community colleges kind of picked up the function of trade school. Now, it's kind of like, and so I asked, and I'm not sure of this, but my understanding, I could be entirely wrong, is that the quality of the community college classes, the students, is a lot lower than that of a regular university college. I'm saying that guardedly. I've seen stuff out there that at least alludes to that. I think there's that thinking in, okay, well, you're going to start, you talk about innovations like this, and I understand the theory and practice of trying to do and all that stuff. So I'm saying, okay, I'm just wondering if that whole community college experience has kind of colored the whole discussion. And then, so we don't want academicians to stay in their ivory towers and critique that. On the other hand, we don't want them to be kind of take the community college and trying to make the workplace with the academia. So I just kind of wanted to.
Well, my 2 cents, I'm a community college graduate, and I actually graduated #1 in my class at USF in both my master's and my undergrad, and I fought that stigma and bias. And I do agree that there are a lot of students in the community college who weren't interested, motivated, or capable, but you can't just stereotype it. And the community college can get it done. And I was there for economic reasons, because that's what we could afford.
I think we were probably both at community colleges 20 or 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, 40 years ago.
I would say, I think that disparity, I think what we've seen in Florida is the community colleges, which are now state colleges, and gosh, now majority of them are 4-year colleges, and granting bachelor's degrees. And so I think in Florida's higher education system, the state colleges have come up, and we are seeing investment back into the VOTEC schools. But the state colleges have come many that are on a graduate school track, you know, from undergraduate to graduate, or in the preparation for graduate degrees and PhDs. And so when you look at it, we've had a tremendous growth in the state colleges with regards to getting up to baccalaureate level and actually feeding the demand at the state university system with a much higher caliber of students. I mean, like, I could not get into USF today, looking back at my transcripts 35 years ago. I mean, the standards in our university system are much higher than they were, and higher, I think, from the state colleges. The state colleges in Florida have elevated with regards to the readiness of those students.
Scott, do you know the statistics on the select student? How many homeschooling children who are 18 years old have already completed their community college and come right into the upper institution as juniors and are hyper-focused? I don't know if that's a significant number, but some of the most talented students use the community college to avoid the four-year strategy.
That's a good point, because we have now, and I did the legislation, now the dual enrolled students, we probably have, maybe 10 or 20% of our college-ready high school students leave high school with anywhere from 15 to almost 60 semester hours of credit in college before they graduate from high school.
My daughter went to Boston College as a junior, just through her AP classes and dual enrollment in that fashion. So some of the most select students come through that process because it's very economically efficient. And if you have an ambition to learn, if they're using the same book that Harvard's teaching out of it, if you can read it and you can comprehend it, and maybe the professor's not as skilled and gifted, which means it takes them longer to help them to understand it, but you still get to the same place. You still get to the same place.
Johnny, I don't know.
We have many of them, I don't even think they're community colleges anymore.
And that might be what will obsolete you. That might be the thing that you guys should be afraid of. There's a reason you don't innovate is because you're not afraid. Fear is a motivator. And it might be the community college system that turns around and obsoletes you because they don't have the burden of tenured professors. So they're like a Hyundai out there when General Motors has got the union to fight to negotiate their wages. And I may start one now. These DBA entrepreneurs might stop you guys before it's all good and bad.
I think one of the issues that came up.
You are joking, but it's not a joke.
It's not fun, but there's some reality to the truth.
The inaugural company.
I myself
A great
took I don't know if they still use the CLEP program, but I CLEP my freshman year. Took an exam unit doing the freshman classes. I lost a athletic scholarship at a state university. Had to go back and work and attend a community college, which I then was the top student graduating in communications from that. Went back to state university. The state universities routinely had 20-point curves on some of their core classes, and way too many students. And I would say that there was a much higher quality ratio to the professor that I got at community college. But again, if you want the education, you'll get it. But I think that the issue that sometimes gets lost is what Grandon was starting as, where does the university want to go? Well, I approach looking at that like that's a question to the university as a business. The business has to maintain some relevance within its purpose. If it becomes something that is going to be better utilized by the community with which in it exists, then it is serving its purpose. Now, people will disagree on what that purpose is, but the idea is if you broaden that to a cooperative with business within your community, there's a much higher likelihood that university is going to be a continued welcome partner and survive financially. So that I think is really
That's a good one. Relevance to community, relevance to, I guess from the business, relative to, to the business community.
Well, let me raise another thing here, but when you're talking about, we're talking about certain areas, obviously I'm coming from a different area of philosophy, we're looking at the liberal arts and so forth. And I think what I'm wondering, and I kind of get this feeling, you go out there and there's certain, I would call them techne-oriented courses and programs, and I would include business in that. And I'm thinking, okay, well, we go out there and we have some of the more mechanical fields. But I see then, I'm wondering then, okay, there are a lot of these people that may get their degrees and blah, 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 but they're
seeing that there is kind of, and I see there's a lot less emphasis on the liberal arts, philosophy, critical thinking, and all these liberal arts things that when I was coming through, and why you guys are coming through, that really liberal arts is what it's all about, and I'm seeing that is really suffering in the universities and colleges. And it's all more technical oriented than it certainly used to be. I may be wrong, I just get that gut feeling.
You know, and I was gonna say, you know, probably as far as where do we wanna go, you know, I'm getting an education on another side of the campus from the campus that I came from, because I'm one of 13 trustees that oversees this 49,000 student free. I'm looking, you know, I have to go back to the salaries and, you know, your distinguished colleague. Well, I'm looking at it, and you know, because I come from the medicine side, and we have a faculty practice plan on the medicine side. And some of these guys are making the same amount of money, but half of their practice is in the faculty practice plan where they're seeing patients. And I look at the talent and the depth of intellectual capital in, you know, our BUMA College of Business, and I'm trying to figure out if maybe one place where we should want to go is like a faculty practice plan of the intellectual capital within the College of Business and its diverse areas of science. And from an entrepreneurial perspective, you know, I'm seeing, you know, an opportunity. So that gets to like relevance and community.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to figure out as we're moving to a virtual world, why are we building more brick and mortar? Not in your campus, but we know the one that we're talking about. And looking about how we become more relevant, both in our science, as well as in you know, the ability to contribute. And so I'm wondering if there's a different way of looking at the faculty, the intellectual capital, and building a much stronger bridge or a conduit to relevance in community and contribution to a state economy, or however you want to frame it.
Well, particularly for a state university, I mean, I would make, you know, a comment as well as it's a mistake to imagine that everybody learns the same way. Because, well, for example, on the previous slide, I kept looking for examples. I'm a person who tends to learn from examples. What do I do in my research? I go out and talk with businesses for case studies. I am constantly confused by philosophy, and I don't tend to learn well that way, but I am in fact the product of a liberal arts education. So that, you know, especially in today's world, where like it or not, our students are gathering information and learning about things in radically different ways from the way we did, it may well be that we need to restructure education to be consistent with their learning patterns. And I don't know that there's any guarantee that basically, you know, taking students and putting them in a setting that resembles 19th century Oxford after they come out of a high school where every class they've been concentrating on 4 different things in parallel, is necessarily going to produce a better outcome when they go out into a workforce and all their colleagues are concentrating on 4 different things in parallel. I don't know the answer. Please, David.
I think we're talking about undergraduate and graduate education, and I think that's late. And I think K through 12 is probably something that we could improve. I think there's no lack of agreement there. And in the sense of relevance to community, my concern is that so much of K through 12 education is kids being taught by imposters, right? Your chemistry teacher is not a chemist. He or she doesn't see the world through chemistry. And then how is that child supposed to see chemistry come alive, or the advantages of seeing the world through the eyes or expertise of a chemist or a business person or and so forth. So maybe one of the things in terms of relevance to the community is if professors could strike up relationships with the K through 12 educational system, and 3 days a week you have conventional junior high school and middle school and high school, and the other 2 days you blow the top off of the thing and you get rid of this imposter thing, and you have actually people come in, and then kids are exposed to that, and you're not going to talk about the nitty gritty of this problem or what I did at work yesterday, but you might talk about these attitudes of self-awareness, self-actualization, and so on and so forth that are critical. And so if they hear that from a historian and a chemist and a biologist, and they go, wow, it's all the same, isn't it? A creative life, there are common threads, and it's more attitudes than skills.
And actually, that brings me to something else that I was going to mention based upon your talk, because you talked about educating in a fundamentally different way, where basically you combine sort of 3 different levels. One, that they're very comfortable with, another a transition, and then another really requiring deep thought. And that really resonated with me, because I found it's always better in my classes to switch up between different techniques to keep people engaged. But also, I suspect, you didn't mention it, but I suspect that there were probably complaints about the fact that you could not cover as much material when you teach that way, as opposed to when you just lecture and you don't care what people understand or not. Because that's something we see all the time in our classes. In other words, we want to try an innovative technique. They say, but you're not covering this, and this. And there's a huge difference between what you cover and what students understand. And it seems to me that your curriculum is one that would be designed to actually promote understanding as opposed to coverage. And I think when, in a world that's expanding, and there's so much more to learn out there, there's a tendency to try and cram all that stuff into this little, into amount of course time. And as far as I know, the number of hours in the year has not increased at the same rate as all the information out there. And so we try to compress it without worrying about whether or not people understand it. And it may be part of what we need to do is lower our sights in terms of the amount of stuff and focus on whether or not they're actually going to retain it more than 15 minutes past the end of class.
Let me generalize that. And you're going to see why I'm trying to generalize it. It's the eternal problem in the educational systems that implicitly, most of the time, they are looking for efficiency. The problem is a trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. And then if we apply the Ashby's variety, and we are in a dynamic system like education, everything is changing. In order to be effective, it's necessary condition to be adaptive. To be adaptive, you have to have variety, requisite variety of Ashby. But the more variety you have, the less efficient you are. So in dynamic system, you cannot maximize efficiency and effectiveness at the same time. You have to make a trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. So if you explicitly or implicitly are increasing the educational efficiency, you are lowering the educational effectiveness in any level of education.
Yeah. Now, I would just like to qualify that slightly, because I suspect what you mean by efficiency is different from what I mean, because when I talk about efficiency, if I throw huge amounts, quantities of material at folks, I don't consider that efficient unless they retain it. To me, efficiency has to be, but I would say the quantity versus quality there.
Let me say it quickly.
Okay.
Efficiency is output divided by input. Resources. Effectiveness is output related to your objectives.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So it's a different kind of relation. You cannot increase that without lowering that, and vice versa in dynamic system. This is a law.
Yeah. And I think whether or not I agree with the specific definition of efficiency, I think I very much agree with the concept, which is the notion that we really need to think about the quality of the output, and how much of what we put in is actually retained as opposed to the quantity of the input. My wife worked as a substitute teacher at a school, and they had absolutely no interest as to whether the students understood the material on the list of things that she had to cover.
How well could they test? How efficient could they deliver the material? How efficiently could they deliver that material so the student could hurry up and take that written test when it was time? Not effectiveness. Did the student know it next year, or in September, August, did they need to start by reteaching for 3 months?
Ironically, they didn't even care about the results of the test because they were upset because she only covered 2/3 of the material. They actually did better on the tests a little bit because they got the 2/3 of the questions of the material that was covered right, and then they got 25% of the remaining questions right by random guessing. So they actually did a little better on the tests, but they did not, but she did not cover, the last third of the material because it was clear that they didn't understand the stuff that she'd already gone.
So you see why it's so important. It's more than important. It's a necessary condition, to separate, not to isolate, but to separate ends from means in order to relate them effectively. Because if you transform the means in an end in themselves, you corrupt the system. You corrupt the procedure.
Yep.
If you transform the means in an end. To count how many papers you publish is a measure of one of the means of education. When this is transformed in an end in itself, in order to survive an academy, you corrupted the systems completely. Because you're not just confusing means with end. You are confusing a way of measuring one of the means with the end. You corrupted the system.
Well, I think with that note, I have somewhat failed in my obligation as the moderator by going over the time.
But your objective was to have a participation.
And it was, yes, right, but yes,
No,
eager to read.
you were